good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our event that celebrates the launch of the Estonian version of Victoria Belimi's book, The Rooster House, or Kukemaja, as we call it in Estonian. My name is Annikky Lamp, and my justification for being here is that I translated the book from English into Estonian, but much more importantly, we also have Victoria, who actually wrote the book, and who is visiting Tallinn after having her 3-week book tour in Germany and before going on to Denmark to promote the book further. But before I ask Victoria all the questions that I have diligently written down so that I don't panic and I have it all here, we have some housekeeping to do because our only real common language is English. We unfortunately need to do this event in English as well. And the questions I mentioned we will cover in approximately 30 minutes, 40 minutes maximum, and then it will be your turn to ask Victoria all the questions that you have. I am well aware that for Estonians there are few things more terrifying than asking questions at public events. We consider it embarrassing. I see you, I agree, I understand, but because I'm in charge of this event, I must ask you this once to reconsider this position and perhaps ask some questions nevertheless. And one final thing, because the book has just come out, so it came out last week. I assume most of you have not read it yet. So I will try not to go into too much detail, not to spoil the reading experience for anyone here. And I will also ask those who maybe have read it. I spot one person who has read it. So all those people of remarkable intelligence and excellent taste who have already read the book, also to keep this in mind and keep the questions and comments general so that we don't spoil the reading experience for others. And but now, let's turn to the book. And thank you so much, Victoria, for being here and joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Annikky, for your hard work on translation. And I have to say, the book has been already translated in 17 languages, but I have not had to interact with so many translators. As a translator myself, I find it very strange that translators are usually kept by the publishing houses so far from the authors whose work they translate. So for me, double kudos to Estonia for making this possible, because I think translators have an important work, not just conveying the words of the author, but actually making the book available in the first place, because it's often the work of love, the work of passion of someone who believes in the project and who makes it happen. So thank you, Annikky, once again.
You're very welcome. So I just said that the book has just been translated, so if you have not read it, in the book Victoria talks also about her own background. It's part memoir, so it also covers the ground of what you've done before, where you come from, your connection to Ukraine. But would you maybe cover this ground a little bit for those who have not read the book yet and would like to know you a little bit better?
I was born in Ukraine, and when I was 15, I left for the United States. So I went to high school, and I finished my university education in the US. And that's where I started working, also working as a writer, as a journalist. And then 12 years ago, I moved to Belgium. And I've been living in Belgium ever since, working as a journalist, as a translator, and also moonlighting sometimes as a fragrance expert, since I also had a chance to study perfumery. And so my connection to Ukraine until 2014 could be described as tenuous at best, because I would return to Ukraine time to time to visit my grandmother, but I did not have a particularly, it's not that I could say I did not have a particularly strong connection to Ukraine, but in some sense my relationship to it was very complicated. And my grandmother Valentina always said it's difficult to leave a place, and it's even more difficult to return. And for someone whose identity spans, two continents, it's true. These returning trips were always put me at kind of odds because it's a place that should be my own, but also sometimes feels like it does not belong to me, or it feels elusive, or cryptic, mysterious somehow. But in 2014, to me, it's a very important year, not just for me personally, but I think for us, for Europe, for the world. Even though at the time very few people, not in Estonia, I have to say, but very few people in Europe realized how important that change, that historical change was. The annexation of Crimea and the start of the Russian aggression that year was really defining for me personally. It was quite traumatic because in my family, my father was Russian, my mother is Ukrainian, and my family really is quite multi-ethnic, multinational. So this whole idea of what was happening, in some sense, I felt like the earth was knocked out from underneath my feet. It's not just because Russia was instigating this conflict, but also because this was happening in Ukraine, the place where I was born, the place that shaped me, and really everything that happened from the start of that year, it kind of pushed me on this journey, trying to figure out what was happening. And I think it's very interesting to talk about this topic here in Estonia, where many people have stories in their families, how the attacks of the Soviet Union, the Soviet regime impacted their relationships, impacted their families, their fates. And I remember actually being in Tallinn in 2014 and going to one of the museums and seeing these really fantastic exposition on Stalin's repressions. And I thought, how come in Ukraine we don't have this kind of discussion? Why, the Stalinist area, just this whole period, just remains kind of, yes, that page in history, but it's not discussed, it's not really processed. And I feel the more time went, the more events evolved, and certainly culminating with the invasion of 2022, I feel like the Soviet history still has so many repercussions on what we experience today and what is happening. So really, these questions are something that inspired me to write this book in the first place.
I think we'll return to this topic of how the book has been received and how it's been received in different places and how that differs. But because I translated the book, but also because I was such a fan of the book already before the translation thing happened, people have often asked me to tell them what the book is about. And I find it actually quite difficult because it's such a blend of genres, and also I'm allergic to giving the plot away, to just summarizing the plot for people. So how do you pitch this book, or when people ask you what the book is about, how do you describe it?
I remember, yes, for me, originally the book started out as an investigation story. So it's a story in which I investigate the disappearance of my great-grand-uncle who disappeared in 1930s. But really, the book is about family. Ultimately, that's what it is. It's about family ties that survive the most difficult tests, including that of the historical trauma. And I think sitting here, we can all agree that the effects of these historical traumas, they linger. They're really felt. And for me, it was really exploration of that more than anything else. Although there are questions, the topics of belonging, the topics of searching for one's patria. And for me, as someone who lived so much of life outside the place where I was born, that's a very important topic. What is patria, and where do we have it? Where do we keep it? Is patria something like a plot of land, a cherry orchard that you claim as your own, or is it something that you carry inside of you? So that's really these questions are going to take this interplay, in some sense, interplay of memoir, family memoir, and a detective story involving so many processes. So I don't know, it's somewhat scary at times.
I just got feedback from the audience that some people don't hear you well enough, so if you maybe keep I feel that I keep it too close and you don't keep it close enough, so let's try to somehow balance. But you just mentioned these different angles, and one thing I struggle with when I try to encourage people to read it, I worry that I make it sound too dark and gloomy, because obviously there are some very dark themes in there. There is the war, the famine, suicide, torture, things like this that don't make for very cheerful reading. But at the same time, there is a lot of humor in there. There is this dry, almost absurdist humor that sometimes I laughed out loud several times when I read it. So there are also topics like nosy neighbors or your dramatic childhood poems, things like that. So was this inclusion of this kind of humor, was it intentional to kind of balance things out? And also, do you think, is this a Ukrainian thing that you developed in response to some very tough times?
I think that's very much a Ukrainian personality trait, and if anything, like writing this book really brought home to me that I'm indeed very much Ukrainian. And despite all these American, etc. layers, that's all just patina, very easily washed away. The premier in the first Ukrainian government in 1917, Volodymyr Venichenkov, was also a writer. He says that you need to take a tranquilizer to read Ukrainian history. And I think, like many Estonians, nod their head and say, ours too. But it's true, once you read about, the war, occupation, in some years a single town is occupied 15 times or 19 times, and, it sounds like a very, just one army enters, the other one leaves, but it's actually quite terrible for people, this kind of anarchy and collapse of everything, people hold for granted. So how do you survive that? It's just, you basically have to look at life, find positive things in life, and take things not so seriously. And it might sound like very facile, just very easy to say that, but I feel like that's really the case. The sense of humor, sometimes it could be quite dark, almost morbid. For instance, the Rooster House, that's former headquarters of the KGB in Poltava, the town where my family is from in Ukraine, it's known to be as the tallest building, because even from down in its basement you can see all the way to Siberia. It's things like that that people say to make light of very horrid, tragic situation. Whenever I would, these days, whenever I call my friends or family, it's just, I end up laughing, but always end up sharing something funny or something absurd, usually something ridiculous that's happening, and that's the way you survive day to day.
In the book, you describe the process, how you decided to return and why you decided to look for your great-granduncle. But how did you decide to write a book about it? Because it's two completely different things, to try to decide to go back to your homeland and try to figure out your family, but not everybody writes a book about it. So when and why did you decide to do that?
In 2014, I would often go to these various conferences and think things about Ukraine. In Brussels, there were so many of them. And invariably, I would come to these events and would find not a single Ukrainian expert on the panel, or else there would be some Russian expert who became overnight an expert on Ukraine. And And often, sometimes there would be like a propaganda twist on certain facts, on certain elements of Ukrainian history, or basic facts were missing. It was all just extremely frustrating. I felt like Ukraine was the terra incognita for the whole world, and it felt frustrating that it was the case in Europe, you know, in Brussels. So just it seemed like Ukraine is so close. And yet, you know, Eastern Europe in general remains this terra incognita, with people having so many stereotypes and preconceived notions. In the US, it's seen as this kind of gray socialist barrack with permanent snow. In Europe, it's a little bit more nuanced. You know, in some places, there's a little bit more information of, you know, what these countries are like. But again, it's all filtered through this, you know, Iron Curtain kind of view of the world. And so I thought I need to write a history book in which I will explain everything about Ukraine and what Ukrainian identity is like, why it's different from Russian. After all, you know, I'm half Russian, so I know what I'm talking about. Well, I was trained as a political scientist, not a historian, and there are people who are better suited to write history books. Plus, I think there are plenty of history books about Ukraine, to read which you have to take more than one tranquilizer. That being said, there are these stories, personal stories, that are fascinating, and I've always loved personal stories, always loved memoirs. And in my family, we kind of have, as many families do, we have this whole, kind of archive of these stories about grandparents and different branches, about people and what they did and how they made us who we are. So I started looking for these stories as sort of inspiration and support, especially during these days, which were very difficult for me in 2014. And that's when I came across the story that did not exist, the story of my great-granduncle. So I just found one line in my great-grandfather's diary that Nicodim, his brother Nicodim, disappeared in the 1930s, fighting for free Ukraine. There was nothing else. And so this was just one line. But what struck me, what really shocked me, was that nobody in the family knew anything about Nicodim, and nobody in the family wanted to talk about him. It just seemed like it was this fear that many of us have not even experienced, like someone of my mother's generation who have not experienced the Soviet Union of Stalin, and but still was permeated with this fear. So it seemed to me like something that was very disturbing and something that needed to be researched. So I decided, at first I thought I'm just going to collect these stories and I'm going to see where it would take me. And once I got to Ukraine and once I started traveling around Ukraine, looking for information, looking for stories, I realized that there was a pattern, that basically this past that we kept stumbling against was a very important factor, and that unprocessed past left us with many wounds. So I thought that putting it down on paper was important as a way to capture that memory, to hold that memory, and to maybe help that memory illuminate something about our present, to solve some of the questions or some of the dilemmas that we're facing.
As you said, the book kind of illuminates the Ukrainian history through those personal stories, but it is very personal, so I always wonder with memoirs, you know, how the family feels about it. Has your family read it? Have they all read it, and what did they think?
My mother was the only one who read the book before it was published. So she read the unpublished manuscript, and so she really liked it. She liked seeing these family stories written down, because we always have these, especially when my great-grandparents were still alive, We still have we have these projects like sitting them down, recording their stories. And on that note, if your grandparents are alive, record their stories. It's precious. These memories, sometimes these like really fine details, like seemingly inconsequential details, can really illuminate so much about their time and their place. So my mother, of course, you know, then she said, everything is great, but this is not correct, or you were not there, or you could not have experienced this, etc. So I made some changes where I felt they were warranted, and others I left as it is, because we all, you know, memory changes the moment it's remembered, and I felt that it was valid, that I have one perception of the situation and she has another.
How was the process for you yourself? Because it is also to a large extent about your personal relationship with Ukraine, and you mentioned earlier that it was complex before you went back, and it was also complex during the time you were there. Did it give you more clarity? Did it give you closure, or did it just give you more pain? Or how was the process for you?
In some sense, being in Ukraine while everything was happening, like I said, Crimea, Donbass, it was easier because I felt, in some sense, it gave me just a sense of purpose. There was very nothing particularly important that I was doing, but I was with my grandmother, and I could contribute to something in the community, so that was very positive. And at the same time, I came back to Ukraine in 2014 with these very new eyes, I would say, because, you know, history in places where it's been rewritten, destroyed, whole layers of population have been eliminated. There's so much, you know, these physical material manifestations of history sometimes could be very difficult to find. And I kept hearing this phrase among people I would meet. They would say, nothing disappears without a trace. And at first, it struck me as absurd. You know, you arrive to these towns where during, especially the 30s, and then in the 50s, there were lots of destruction of architectural heritage, especially churches, you know, historical buildings. And you arrive to these towns where they really look just like barracks, gray barracks, these prefab buildings, and you say nothing disappears without a trace. There is nothing to see here. There is nothing to find here. And then you realize that actually history is there. It's hiding. This old history, it's hiding in every corner. It's just, you need to know how to look for it. And so I started, I was so open, talking to people, hearing their stories, and meeting people. It was so easy, and I think through these encounters, really, that was so inspiring. I would go to a church, I would go to a mosque or a synagogue or some, you know, museum, and talk to people who would work there. And the next thing I know, they're inviting me to share a meal, and then they're inviting me to go on a trip with them, because in Ukraine also Ukrainians are avid travelers in general. And I don't know whether it's something cultural or whether because, you know, for such a long time it was impossible to travel, but there were suddenly, I found these small travel groups, hobby travel groups. And there was one in particular that I found that was called Anywhere But Home. And every weekend the group would take off in a rented bus that immediately would break down in some cornfield. But we would go and explore some broken mansion or some little house that belonged to someone famous, or these little villages that made some sort of handicraft. And you know, you could say it's nothing, you know, special, it's not Versailles, but it was so exciting for all of us. And through these encounters, really, Ukraine started taking shape for me. I discovered a place with so much history, so much tradition, so much richness, and it was really fascinating. So I would say, that through this journey, my experience of Ukraine became deeper. That sense, I found that sense of home, but I realized also that Patria was in me, that I did not have to be, physically in Ukraine to feel that Patria was there.
You mentioned earlier that the book has now been translated into 17 languages, and you have been to many of those places, on the ground, talking about the book, meeting people. So I wonder how the reception has differed from place to place. Because one thing I felt when I was first reading and then translating was that it really helped me that I was Estonian, that it gave me a little bit of a way in, because we have a little bit of a shared experience, especially in recent times with the Soviet occupation, with Soviet collapse. But not only these big historical events, but just small things like this obsession with one's garden and kind of putting one's almost self-worth into this, perhaps because of the absence of other outlets for self-expression, or elderly ladies selling wildflowers in the streets. So I felt that I was closer to the text than maybe some other people would be. But then I thought maybe and that's probably true for many countries in the eastern part of Europe. But perhaps I'm just trying to feel special. But did you see any difference, and what were the differences?
That's actually a very interesting question. And I think, yeah, definitely there are different ways in which people relate to the book. Of course, some people read, this book is not about the war, it's not about the present war. This book was finished before the invasion started, and I did not change anything in the book because of that. The manuscript was already complete and finished, and I only added, forward to acknowledge the events, because it felt strange not to gloss over something that monumental, that important. And in general, the way we read, most people read, is you put something through the prism of your own experiences. This happened to me, I can recognize that. And I think, some themes of belonging, generational conflict, because the book, in some sense, was inspired by a very important generational conflict that I had with my uncle Vladimir, my father's older brother. But because these themes are so easy to relate to, many people found that it resonated with them. But some of the really interesting discussions about the book that I had happened with my readers in Latin America or in Catalonia. Again, places that experienced violence and where violence and traumas, these historical traumas, define, families. They have these lingering, lasting, scars, and also the inability to tell your story, because the tragedy that I think, in Estonia, in Ukraine, in many countries where there was these authoritarian regimes that have the experience of authoritarian regimes, is that personal history becomes kind of this taboo topic. The story, once you don't have, once history is written and rewritten, there is kind of a standard history that's established. Red Army liberates Stalin, and these kind of frames of history. Your personal story becomes dangerous or irrelevant at best. And in many places around the world, that's still the case. So when I would speak with my readers in Latin America, there was this immediate recognition. It's just how violence defines you know, families, defines family relationships, communities. And in general, I think history, it was Gramsci who said that, but history defines us down to our intimate expressions, even when we don't realize it.
You already mentioned that the book was written after Crimea happened, but before the full-scale Russian aggression, so it's between those two big milestones. And you said that you didn't change anything in the book, but I just wonder, if you look back at the book now, do you think you could write the same book again? I mean, obviously not exactly the same book, but could you write it in the same way, or if anything has shifted for you, or if you could change something without kind of ruining the whole thing, would you change something? Because so much has happened since then.
You know, that's an interesting question, and I often wondered myself, especially once I received my manuscript last year, you know, from my UK publisher, and they asked me if I wanted to make any changes. So at that moment, I was so involved with different activities in community to help Ukrainian refugees in our community in Belgium, etc. So it just felt like writing was kind of the least important thing that I could do at the time. But somehow I think for me the important valuable part about this book, as I see it, is that it's really a glimpse of Ukraine and Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian psyche, Ukrainian identity, without this element, without this prism of war reporting. You know, war, of course, is an echo in the book, because 2014, we were already living through a very difficult time. But the war does not define Ukraine the way it defines Ukraine for me, and not to mention the rest of the world now. And that's the danger. You know, war and war reporting always tends to dehumanize things, places, people. And also you start saying, okay, well, is this important? Should I write about these embroideries, these handicrafts, or this cherry orchard? And I remember one of my readers said, but there was a war going on in 2014 and you were planting cucumbers with your grandmother. I said, yes, because planting cucumbers is the most important thing that you can do anytime, war or not. You know, life goes on, and that's kind of the number one lesson. Just whatever happens, you kind of have to retain a sense that tomorrow will come. So you plant those cucumbers, even you don't know what's going to happen, you know, 2 hours later.
But I assume the fact that the war did unfortunately arrive did also impact the journey of the book, so to speak. That on one hand, I assume there was more interest in the book because people were looking for text, they were looking for ways to know Ukraine better, also outside the war, to know the history better, to know Ukrainian culture and crafts. At the same time, it must have also been, and I'm sure still is, difficult for you to, you know, go to these places on a daily basis and talk again about war, about the history of Ukraine that we have all agreed requires some fortitude to talk about. So, you know, how has all this kind of come together, and how has it felt for you?
You know, the difficult part, is always that, you know, as a Ukrainian and as a Ukrainian of some prominence, you suddenly, you know, people often assume that, you know, we know more than they do about the situation, and often in interviews, in all seriousness, I would be asked questions like, so how do you think the war will evolve? When will it end? Do I have a crystal ball? Do I have a direct line to Putin? I don't. I don't know. Then you kind of have to come up with a question or just say, I really don't know how to answer this. I hope it will end soon, but just no amount of political science analysis can really give you perspective on a conflict of this scale and still ongoing. So the best I felt I could do just is to use my position to talk about Ukrainian culture, or to support causes that were important, whether it's looking for funds to rebuild certain cities, or at least bomb shelters in cities that were destroyed by Russian bombardments, and or to support refugees, support communities in our town, or support the artists about whom I also talk a lot in this book, since Poltava is a town in central Ukraine. I think in Sweden the name is kind of has this very bittersweet ring, because it's the site of the very tragic battle for Sweden in the 18th century battle that Sweden lost, and well, the consequences were quite important for Estonia and the Baltics as well. But these days, Poltava for Ukraine, it's a very important cultural center. So Ukrainian language, as we speak it today, is really originates from the Poltava dialect of Ukrainian. The national dress, songs, so much, has roots in Poltava. And as a result, once you start traveling in the region, you find that every village has some sort of specialty, whether it's ceramics or sculpture, wood carving, embroidery, weaving, and it seemed like every village has some sort of school, the Soviet era dilapidated school, but with someone who's very passionate about protecting, their craft and their art. And it was really fascinating just to meet these people, to talk to them, and then, as I keep in touch with them, to see how they're doing, how they're surviving, what they're doing, what help they need, etc.
There's one question that, considering your background and the fact that you have family in Israel and you have also deep interest in Arab culture and history, I just wanted to ask, because we have the Ukraine war, the most recent phase going on for more than 600 days now, but in the recent weeks we have seen the tragic events in Middle East unfolding as well. And as you look at this, what is happening in Israel and Palestine, with your very intimate experience of the Ukrainian tragedy, do you see any parallels between the things that are happening, or do you see any false equivalence, or anything you think people should keep in mind as they see those two things unfolding in parallel?
I think whenever a war takes place, any war, there's always a tendency to look for precedents elsewhere. So, when the annexation of Crimea happened in 2014, and when the Russian invasion happened in 2022, immediately there were all these wars that were brought up. In 2014, we heard often the Balkan Wars being used as kind of the model for what was happening in Ukraine. Completely wrong in my opinion, just very different conflicts. But in general, it's always easy to look for parallels, but the roots of any conflict are always quite unique, and there are so many parameters that define them. My sense also, just as I look at the conflict in the Middle East and Israel and Palestine, we got to the point where we cannot even talk about it in any nuanced way, because everything becomes so completely polarized and very extremely strongly defined in one way or another by one particular messaging or another, and as a result there's kind of no room for any nuanced analysis. But the tragic part is that what's ended up happening is these places just become completely devoid of their human element, and it's the same thing you can observed in many other conflicts, whether it's in Syria or in Iran, but I think it's particularly the case with Israel and Palestine. So it's always worth remembering that in these places, that are completely ripped apart by such violence and tragedy, these human stories and these cultural elements and how the culture, how people use, their identity, their cultural elements, these cultural precepts to help them live through this experience, I think to me is really like one of the most fascinating parts.
On much lighter note to everyone's relief, this is something I have to ask because I'm Estonian, and the thing we most like to know is what others think about us. So you have been Italian before, and you know some Estonian people. Is there anything that stands out to you about Estonians and Estonia? Anything you find typical, weird, or special about this country and people?
I always found, Estonians have this stoicism about them, which is very endearing to me, and there is also this dry sense of humor, which I like very much, and it's I think if you just speak very broadly in broad strokes about these cultural stereotypes, and these cultural stereotypes are very, let's say, general, but they often tend to be true. Estonians and Ukrainians are different in many ways. I think Ukrainians tend to be a little bit more vocal and gregarious, but there is some element which I always found very familiar, is just that attachment to one's own land, and so this idea of the cherry orchard and taking care of the cherry orchard or apple orchard, and making sure that none of those apples go to the birds and are preserved and processed some way. That's something I recognized immediately, because those are the conversations that I had with my grandmother, and when I was visiting her. So I came to Ukraine in April of 2014, and she mentioned something about the garden, so just brushed it off. But my grandmother, when it comes to the garden, she had these very Napoleonic plans, and she completely intended to use me as free labor. And when she asked me casually, will you help me a little bit in the garden? And I said, yes. I did not anticipate that would be planting, potatoes for days on end. Or after potatoes were planted, I did not imagine that. I thought that was it, we're done. No, then there were cucumbers and I don't know, every single agricultural product that you can plant in Ukraine, I think we planted it. And in some sense, I joke, I started these travels around Ukraine just to escape the orchard and to save my back. Because I'm an urban person. I enjoy gardening and, but mother does this.
Yeah, this part resonated with me very strongly as well, because I spent large parts of my childhood as a personal garden slave for my grandmother. And once I asked her why she needed to wake up 4 a.m. every morning to do the chores, and she said, well, so that I have all the morning chores done by 6 a.m., which seemed completely logical to her, less logical perhaps for me. But this is my last question. I'm saying this so that you can all start preparing your questions. Well, I think, Victoria, you are I know quite a lot of interesting people, if I say so myself, but I think you are the one with the broadest interest that I know, from translating Persian poetry to, having a deep expertise in perfumes to, studying useless political science, as your grandmother would put it. So I very much hope that you will write another book very soon, but what would it be about, considering that there are so many options to choose from?
At the moment, I'm finishing a Persian translation. I'm working with an Iranian writer, Zahra Abdi, and I'm translating her novel. So that translating to me was just really a chance to step back and just to change my pace a little bit. And then I'm thinking of a new project, and I still am trying to decide whether it's going to be about travels, or whether it's going to be about culture, about art. There is something that interests me, just art, but also the communities that are created around these artistic pursuits. And that was something that was really interesting for me in Ukraine, when I would go to these villages and I would meet people who, for instance, are interested in embroideries, or they would weave carpets, and around there would be people who could paint, who knew how to dye fabrics using natural dyes, natural plants. And so there were all these disappearing, I would say, like very niche enterprises, and yet they had this very vibrant, cultural life, and that seemed very interesting, how they existed, how they survived, even conditions of utter misery and economic collapse. And for instance, when I would speak with Nadia Vakulenko, he actually, this embroidery pattern on the book cover, it's from one of her embroideries, and I took that picture and I really liked it. I thought it was just very charming, and then she said, "Why did you pick the simplest one?" And well, when I would speak with Nadia about her work, what is she doing, does she need help, and she would say, well, during, especially in the early days, early months of the invasion, so they would spend their morning either cooking for the soldiers or making some, small explosive devices, and then in the evening she would get home and start embroidering. So, and to her that, I thought, this is brave, such resilience, but she said, well, what else am I going to do? That's kind of, this is it. So I think like these kind of topics also are interesting because there's so many of them, and when I would travel around and I find more of these kind of vanishing arts, vanishing cottage industries, and I always found it interesting because they had such a strong tie to local culture, and so it's very paradoxical in some sense. The practitioners are aging, but at the same time, everyone agrees that these things need to be preserved.
I like how you casually mentioned making small explosive devices in passing. So, audience, come through for me. Any questions? In the first row.
Yeah, so I assume you wrote this originally in English, but presumably one of the 17 translations has maybe also been into Ukrainian?
No.
No?
No, there has not been a Ukrainian translation.
So there's no, but also, is it available in Russian? No? Okay.
No.
So people in Ukraine, they have no idea that this exists. There's no reception in Ukraine to speak of.
Ukrainian publishing has been very, very complicated even before the war started. So before, I would say, when I came back to Ukraine in 2015, what struck me was that how little Ukrainian language was supported. In Poltava, for instance, I had difficulty finding a newspaper in Ukrainian. There was so much, Russian publishing books were cheaper in Russian. There were also more translations available of kind of like the pop literature and bestsellers. And so it really dominated the market so totally. And the situation gradually improved as I came, to realize. But what happened before, for Ukrainian publishers, the libraries would buy a certain percentage of what they would publish, and quite high. Then, with the invasion, the libraries basically don't have that capacity. The government does not provide funds that the libraries are managed to do that. Many publishing houses now operate outside of Ukraine, and this is compounded by the paper crisis that affects publishing in the whole world. So, in some sense, I was at the Frankfurt Book Fair recently, and I met some Ukrainian publishers. So we started talking about this book becoming, being published in Ukrainian. So it's an ongoing project, but just to say that it's far from a straightforward one.
Have you had reactions from Ukrainians who've read this in other languages?
Yes, they were uniformly positive. People enjoyed seeing, the places they know, mention the stories. They could relate to the story that I was telling, and that to me was a very, promising, positive sign that this is not just the book to explain Ukraine to the non-Ukrainians. It's even though I wrote it initially as such, but then I realized I was just describing my Ukraine.
Anyone else?
Well, that's from my professional point of view. You have studied almost 20 languages, and I can understand all these Central European languages, but why Japanese, Persian, Indonesian? How come?
Every language that I studied has some story. It's kind of like, the collection of objects that you have at home, and then you could say, oh, well, this I bought from this travel, or etc. For me, some languages I studied purely based on romantic reasons, because, I liked Schumann's music, so I decided to study German. But with Japanese, I found I started studying it actually when I was still a teenager, and by myself. It was something that really was something that I was curious about it. It was it inspired some fantasy perhaps, and a place, a different culture, something new. With Persian, it's a strong connection that I always had with Persian literature, Persian poetry, because my grandmother used to read Persian poetry to me, poetry, Hafez and Sadi, and in Russian translation, but still, I grew up with those sounds, with those metaphors, with those words, and then later, I started traveling in places like Indonesia, and I learned Indonesian mostly just to be able to travel. And in some places where I would visit farmers that were growing aromatic materials for the fragrance industry. So, and I decided that I would pick up a little bit of Indonesian. But the more I traveled, the more I explored, the more curious I became, and sort of, in some sense, I would feel like once I, start studying language, once I learn enough that I communicate, it becomes like it's something like a pet that I need to maintain. And of course, with 20, it's very difficult to maintain them all at the same level. But I try to do my best. Well, reading really is one of the most effective ways to maintain, that memory, that facility with language use. But mostly, I just like talking. So I'm talking to people, talking to strangers, and talking to strangers in their own language usually makes for most interesting conversations.
Thank you.
I used to think I was pretty good at languages, and then I met Victoria. So. Signe, you had a question.
Jaa, aitäh. Kuna kaks minu esimest küsimust on ära küsitud, et see on nii kummaline, et sa istud samas ruumis ja sa tahad küsida just seda, mida tuttav küsis siin ja sa tahad seda. Siis ma küsin, et kas Victoria on lugenud ka mõnda, ma kardan, et kindlasti on või arvan, Eesti kirjaniku teost. On tal kontakte Eesti kirjandusega? Aitäh.
Have you read anything by Estonian authors? Do you have any relation to Estonian literature?
Jan Kross. I read his novels, and I always found it like really incredible. He's someone who's very good at languages, most of which he learned during his imprisonment. I always find interesting how he used historical events to create these very interesting narratives. Quite striking.
Very impressive. Maria?
I had a horrifying experience as well. My question was spontaneously answered by the author within the last 2 minutes of the main event. It was going to be about the embroidery because it was something that you mentioned a few times, and then you pointed out the significance of the embroidery on the cover of the book. But my question then would be a little bit more simplistic then. Do you embroider yourself? Is this one of your 1,000 hobbies that you have picked up?
So when I was in Ukraine and I would go to visit Nadia, the master embroiderer, she taught me how to embroider, and I learned embroidery even when I was very young, and it was something that was taught in school, and my grandmothers did. And when I was little, I had much more patience than I do now, and so and have the proof in the embroideries that my mom still keeps. But so when I would visit Nadia, I would see all these beautiful things she would embroider, and especially in these old techniques that are really rare that you can hardly see. And I would see her students and I would immediately become fired up and decide I want to embroider something too. So she kindly taught me. And while I would be in Ukraine, I would embroider every time I would spend time with her. And then I would return home, and now it's just embroidery is a fantastic meditative exercise. It really kind of makes you go inside yourself, and I'm not into this new age. Meditation is to me is very difficult. It somehow brings out the most negative aspects of my personality. So maybe, but embroidery is just very relaxing. That being said, the question is, like, do I embroider, or do I spend an hour on, improving my Japanese, or translating, or writing, or cooking something, or just going to a museum? So it's, I embroider very, very rarely.
One thing I thought when I was reading the book, that we should start giving out the title of Master Embroiderer in Estonia as well. I think it would improve the image of the profession to no end. It just sounds so good.
No, it's really fantastic. But embroidery, I mean, it's really interesting. Among all the crafts, textile crafts, they often receive the least amount of attention as these kind of high art pursuits. And in Ukraine, in the Soviet Union, in general, some of these local crafts were actually folklorized, because in the Soviet Union, at some point, there was just also this process of creating ethnicities. It was done like particularly extensively in Central Asia, where whole countries were kind of given cultural histories, and they're like cultural artifacts. So in Ukraine, some of these embroidery was selected as the art to be promoted during Soviet times. So colleges were established, certain university degrees, and these master embroider titles. So then the local patterns would be taken and kind of simplified and standardized, kind of turned into something folkloric and kitsch. So on the other hand, the artisans continued to work these factories, and yet create something on their own. So kind of they took advantage of the resources available to them to do these kitschy, very basic things that the Soviet boss standards demanded, and yet to preserve, their techniques, to preserve their heritage. That, especially embroidery, often linked to religious embroidery, religious arts. So it was quite fascinating.
Right. I don't really want to ruin the reputation of Estonians for shyness, of course. One of our questions, but as I'm quite a bit into things Ukrainian, so I read the book already in English, and enjoyed it a lot. And as I know the politics of it, well, then it was a family story rather for me. And having had difficult conversations with my relatives on political subject for the last 30 plus years at least, then I was wondering, you use the word polarizing for the Middle Eastern conflict, people there and discussions. Well, now, obviously, I read the book during the full-scale war, and then I felt that, well, these kind of conversations or arguments like you had with your uncle Vladimir, these are so much more difficult today to have, most likely, because, well, you could afford to be sort of post-Soviet in 2014, but in 2023, not really. How do you see it?
I see, in some sense, yes, it's more difficult in one sense, but in another, people who are kind of like ambivalent, the situation really pushed them to take either one side or another. Right now, you cannot really just kind of sit on the fence and not have a position. And the urgency that I felt in 2014 was that in 2014 it felt like if we could do something, we would still stop it. I mean, perhaps it was very naive, perhaps, just really what, the things that we could have done to stop it. It's not even in 2013, but much earlier, before Russia, and Russian money and these corrupt oil money were able to infiltrate so much of, the political system in Europe and the economy in Europe. So it felt to me, in some sense, in 2014, I felt that these conversations were very relevant and important and having these debates. Now it's more of a point, I feel people just avoid often talking about it if they are on, opposite sides. With my uncle, for instance, I know his position, and I don't think his pro-Russian position has not changed dramatically in the past 10 plus years. But I just at the same time, he's 84. He's not going to change. I don't have sufficient authority or patience or anything else to be able to compete with Russian propaganda that he absorbs via Russian language television. So I accept it. We talk about yoga, we talk about photography. That's good enough for me.
Any other questions in the audience? If not, I will just ask the last one on a slightly lighter note and try to bring together two things that you know very well. Because apart from speaking 7 million languages and being a political scientist and embroidering and translating from all the languages, you also have the best perfume blog on the internet. One of the first ones and still the best, in my humble or not so humble opinion. So what does Ukraine smell like to you?
Lilac, lindens, and that smell of the chestnut leaves. The autumnal leaves, and especially chestnut. They have this kind of the bitter, pungent smell that once it becomes autumn, you immediately can smell in the air. And in fact, where I live in Brussels, not too far away, there's a big park and full of chestnuts. And whenever I walk through that park, I feel like I have like a little piece of Ukraine there. And in general, you know, just smells are really so fascinating because smells are processed by the same part of the brain that processes memories and emotions. And for this reason, when a smell can really evoke so clearly and fully a person, a time, place, an emotion, and it also can be fascinating once you start noticing more smells in your surroundings. Your world really becomes so much more vibrant.
You actually describe many smells that are very Estonian too, so we have another thing where we can claim that Estonia and Ukraine have a very deep connection. So thank you so much, Victoria, for coming. Thank you for the audience for doing a very good job. And everybody, of course, should purchase the book or two, and also maybe another one for a Christmas present later on. So thank you once more for this, making this such a wonderful event, and we'll stop here for now.